Welcome to Section 3.1. What are congruent figures? Our objective is to understand congruent figures and their corresponding parts. For homework, we're going to have a worksheet. So the first thing we have to understand is what congruent figures are. Congruent figures have all pairs of corresponding parts congruent. Now, corresponding parts. Let's talk about what that actually means. Corresponding parts means if we have congruent figures, it means that each side and each angle has a congruent match. Now, we need to understand how congruent figures are created. And the first way congruent figures are created is by a translation, which means that we take the exact same triangle, or whatever polygon we're dealing with it, and just shift it. Shift it down, shift it up, shift it strictly to the right or to the left. That's what a translation is. A translation is going to be another word for a slide. Next, we have a rotation. If we have congruent figures that are congruent based on a rotation, we can rotate our figure and make congruencies. Now, last but not least, we can have a reflection. Reflections are going to be created by taking the exact same figure and reflecting it over a line, over a point, or over an angle, but keeping congruent figures. One way to prove that a pair of polygons are congruent is to show that all pairs of corresponding sides and angles are congruent. So if it's a triangle, we need to have 3 congruent sides and 3 congruent angles. If it's a quadrilateral, we need to have 4 pairs of congruent sides and 4 pairs of congruent angles. If it would be pentagons, we would need 5, hexagons 6, so forth and so on. But we need to have pairs. 3 sides on one triangle matching with 3 sides of another triangle. What that would look like is, let's say that we have these 2 triangles here. We would need to have 3 pairs of angles that matched up. There's one pair, here's the second pair, and here's the third pair. There's my 3 congruent angles. My 3 congruent sides. Here would be one pair, here would be a second pair, and here would be a third pair. Now, just looking at this pair of congruent triangles with 3 congruent angles and 3 congruent sides, what happened here was a translation. With translations, all we have is we have a pair of triangles where one of the triangles is just slit from side to side. In this case, we had our original triangle slighted to the right. Remember, we can have rotations, and we can also have reflections. Now, the reflexive property is any segment or angle is congruent to itself. Now, how is this going to be used when we talk about proving triangles congruent? What we have here is, if we have a triangle, and we have a triangle that's actually going to be congruent because of a reflexive line. What we would have here is, not only do we have one triangle, but we have 2 smaller ones right here. So let's go ahead and throw some letters in here. Let's say that we have A, B, C, and D. What we would have here is we would need to know 2 pairs of sides are congruent, 3 pairs of angles are congruent, but I'm actually going to be missing a 3rd side right here. Now, this 3rd side is actually a shared side. It's shared between both triangles. It's segment AB. Segment AB is a side of this left triangle and a side of this right triangle. We can say segment AB from the left triangle is congruent to segment AB from the right triangle by the reflexive property. That would be my 3rd set of congruency. So let's try one together. I want to know, are the triangles congruent? If so, name the congruent triangles, but be sure to have the correspondence of the letters correct. What that means is if my triangles are congruent, when I name my triangles, I want the orders of the letters to match congruent segments and congruent angles. So here we go. Let's look at my picture first and foremost. And I want to ask myself, do I have 3 sets of congruent sides? There's 1, there's 2, and here's 3. Beautiful. Angles. There's 1, there's 2, but I'm missing a third one. I only have 2 sets of congruent angles. Do I have any reason where I can say my third sets of angles are congruent to each other? Absolutely. These angles would be congruent because their vertical angles are congruent. We can say that in a proof, so it's okay. Now, these triangles are congruent. I have 3 sets of congruent sides, and I have 3 sets of congruent angles. So let's go ahead and let's order these. My first triangle I get to list in whatever order I want. I'm going to call it triangle ABC. Now, I want to be very careful about how I name my second triangle. In my first triangle, this left one, triangle ABC, on the A angle I had 2 tick marks. So on my second, my rightmost triangle, I want to start off naming the angle that has 2 tick marks, which would be my angle E. My second letter is B. B had a 1 tick mark on it. I want to match it up the same way, which would be D. Last but not least, C on my left triangle, which match with C on my right triangle. All of my angles match up, so let's go ahead and look at the segments. For the segments, my first segment that was listed was side AB, which had a 3 tick mark on it. Let's look at ED. ED also had 3 tick marks on it. Let's look at my last 2 letters, BC. BC had a 2 tick mark on it. Let's go to DC. DC also has a 2 tick mark on it, so the correspondence is matching up. Let's look at my first and last. AC had a 1 tick mark on it, and let's look at EC. EC also has a 1 tick mark on it. The correspondence of the letters is correct because all of the angles match up and all of the sides match up. Now you try one. Are the triangles congruent? If so, name the congruent triangles and be sure to have the correspondence of the letters correct. So look at the picture, decide if the triangles are congruent. If so, write a congruency statement, making sure those letters match up. Press pause and let's see where this goes. So here we go. I am missing one of my sides. I have my 3 sets of angles that have matches, and I have 2 of my 3 sides that have matches. What I'm missing is my third side. Now, BC on my top triangle is the same as BC on the bottom triangle. By the reflexive property, we can state that. So I can put in my third set of congruency. Now, the top triangle, name in any order. I'm going to name mine ABC, but you could have named yours different. Now I need to match up. Angle A had a 1 tick mark, just like D. My first letter should be a D. Next, my B. My B had a 2 tick mark on my top, and B has a 2 tick mark on the bottom. The B's should match up. Lastly, C on my top triangle has 3, just like C on my bottom one. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DBC. Now, double check your sides. Side AB has a 2 tick mark on it, just like side DB does. Side BC and BC match up, they had 3 tick marks. Side AC has a 1, just like side DC does. The correspondence of the letters is congruent. Now this brings us to our last example. We're going to try and do a proof. Remember, in proving congruent polygons, we want to show that all sides and all angles have matches. Now, for this one, we have a lot of givens. So our givens. Let's start marking off our tick marks as we have them. AB is congruent to AD. AB is congruent to AD. If you draw it, we're going to write it. Next, angle B is congruent to angle D. If we're going to draw it, we're going to write it. Next, angle ACB is congruent to angle ACD. Now, do we put right angle tick marks? No. The reason why is we don't know that these segments are perpendicular, just that these angles are congruent. Now, there is a way to say that there's right angles, but for us right now it's not going to be important. If we draw it, we're going to write it. Next, AC bisects AB. We can't draw anything, so we're going to write it. And last but not least, AC bisects angle BAD. Nothing to draw, I don't have congruency. The only time we draw things in is when we state congruency. So there's all my givens. So now, my next step is I'm going to say segment AC is congruent to segment AC. Why can I say that? Because of the reflexive property. I drew it in, make sure you write it. The second thing I always look for is I always look for reflexive sides and I look for vertical angles. Next, I'm going to say BC is congruent to CD, and here's the reason why. AC bisected BD, which means it chopped BD in half. I'm going to draw in my tick marks. My reason is saying definition of a bisector. My next step. AC also bisected angle BAD. So angle BAC is congruent to angle DAC by definition of a bisector. Now, my triangles are congruent. The reason is I have 3 sets of congruency. So how are we going to word this? Let's word it as an if-then. If all the corresponding parts of a polygon are congruent, the polygons are congruent. So what that means is if we have matches on 2 triangles, each angle and each side have matches, then we know my polygons are going to be congruent. Now, tomorrow's worksheet is going to reinforce the concepts of congruency, and we're going to focus on the proofreading. The answers to the worksheet are going to be posted on the board tomorrow. If you have any questions, please make sure you're stopping in to see me, whether that's after school, during connection period, before school, or seeing someone in a study hall. If this is not clicking, we need to make sure we're getting help. Have a good one.